Today we are looking at Amazing Heroes number 25, a special 25th anniversary spectacular 116 pages for June 15th, 1983. And as you can see, a big Ronin issue. There's a big Ronin feature in here that we'll get to, however briefly. I've marked a few pages, as you can see up here, so I won't be going through all 116 pages, but trust me, there's a lot of stuff in here. Let's just skip all the way ahead to over here. The news flash is always fun to see what was going on in the summer of 1983 at this point. And this first story is interesting to me because it was just a topic of conversation at Rob Liefeld's podcast. So if you listen to Rob's Observations, you know he did a recent episode strictly on Paul Smith's legendary run on the Uncanny X-Men. Well, here's the lead news story of this issue. If you like Paul Smith's version of Marvel Comics' The X-Men, you'll be sorry to learn that he will be leaving the title with number 177. Smith cited disagreements with writer Chris Claremont and general lack of interest in the book as his reasons for leaving. Now, Rob Liefeld has a different memory of those events, and I think the two merge together pretty well. Liefeld had heard Paul Smith at a convention talking to fans about how he just wanted to, get on his bike and cross the country, and he only had ever planned to be there for a year and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, this fan magazine here is saying he had a general lack of interest in the book as his reason for leaving. So, which is actually true? I kind of think they both could be. I have a funny feeling he probably was, being nice in front of the fans and not trying to air any dirty laundry out there. But Fantagraphics, the Comics Journal, they have a history of having these ridiculously honest interviews. If you've read the Comics Journal, especially in the 80s, even into the 90s, you'd often find interviews with creators where they would talk about stuff that you were surprised they would talk about out loud. Like, you'd be worried they'd be getting fired the next day for the stuff they said about the companies they were working for. It was just a different time. And in this day and age, when everyone tries to be nice until, the straw breaks the camel's back, so to speak, you don't hear people talking ill about their employers or even their recent employers who they may have left under less than stellar circumstances. They just don't want to burn those bridges because the comics world is too small. But for whatever reason, back in the 80s and 90s, especially in the Comics Journal, those bridges would be in fuego. It was fun to watch and fun to read. Replacing Smith on the X-Men will be John Romita Jr., who previously illustrated Marvel's Favorite Mutants in X-Men Annual number 4. He begins at 178, and he also plans to continue illustrating The Amazing Spider-Man. I don't know if that actually worked out or not, but that was the plan. Smith said he would go on to draw some Doctor Strange stuff again. Unknown if Terry Austin will be available to continue to ink him. I don't know what the timeline on that is. I know there at least was one ad I saw somewhere in a different Amazing Heroes talking about Paul Smith doing Doctor Strange, so I guess he went back at some point. Someone else can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, of course. Now, for those of you who've been following this series for a while, this YouTube channel for a while, I have to mention this. A Doctor Strange one-shot in 3D was going to be released in December and retail for $250. Did that come out? Does anyone know? I haven't seen that in my 3D searches. That might be interesting depending on who drew that, if it was just a reprint of a previous issue or not, but that could be good. And, of course, many readers will be surprised that Steve Gerber will soon be writing for Marvel Comics again. That's after the whole Howard the Duck kerfuffle. But apparently Mike Friedrich was able to negotiate a contract between the two parties, and he went on to do Void Indigo there with Val Mayerick. Skipping ahead a bit now, we're going to come over to, first, the silly cover. I'm not sure I understand. Oh, this is, I guess, Daredevil meets Ronin. I guess that's the joke. Okay, let's go to Coming Distractions here. What's going on for books that were shipping in May of 1983? Nexus was continuing in full color. Cerebus, the Aardvark, was reaching the grand finale of High Society. Wow, that goes back a bit, doesn't it? I had a backup story about a tribute to John Lennon from Valentino. If anyone would be doing a John Lennon comic book or comic story, Valentino sounds like the right person to do it. And here is the introduction to Ronin. I think maybe the first issue might have been out at this point, but they're talking about it in the future, so maybe not. 6-issue series. 48 pages long, printed on 60-pound paper stock, because again, as I've mentioned before in all these Amazing Heroes issues, paper stock was a big issue in comics in the early 80s. Mostly because we were finally getting upgrades from newsprint thanks to the direct market. A lot of the direct market, direct-only stuff came out in special paper, whether it's Mando or Baxter or what would eventually become the Dark Knight format or the Prestige format, all that kind of stuff. In fact, it mentions here, this is not Baxter paper. It has a finish to it that resembles that of a coated stock, although it is not coated and it does not shine. That sounds good to me, actually. The shining is where the paper stock becomes a big problem, especially with the more expensive pages. So this article goes on to talk in depth about the series. There is an interview with Frank Miller along the way, lots of pencils, lots of inks, finished pages you can find across here. It does go on here specific, having a 2-page ad. There's Sergio Aragonés' Gru the Wanderer, number 5 that we're up to at this point. More Ronin, talking about his influence from French comics, Moebius, and even Eisner. This is one of those reasons I like Frank Miller. Let's get into it because, you know, me and bande dessinée. Miller had seen a little bit, quote-unquote, of French comics graphic novels from Howard Chaykin and Walt Simonson at the studio where he worked with them. Eventually, many of these French comics albums, they put that in quotes because people didn't know what albums meant back then, became available in New York City. And Miller started looking at it, and it started knocking him out. I mean, he says, who could look at Valerian or the work of Moebius and not have it affect you in some way? Especially when you're doing science fiction. Yeah, ask George Lucas in Star Wars, Frank. It's almost a perfect opposite to the Japanese material. The French are completely absorbed in form. He credits the work of Bilal and Moebius, especially with the work he's got going on in the first issue of Ronin. The technology scenes get less and less French as it goes along, he says. Like anybody trying something new, I imitated what was around and what had succeeded. I know that the opening technological scenes are very heavily influenced by Moebius. Yes, I agree with that. My problem is simply that not having done science fiction before, I got swallowed up by Moebius, and as I kept going on it, though, I started finding things that were really different from that, and as soon as the second issue, you'll see that it looks very different. Yes, that's true. And then he makes some good points about Moebius' work here, actually. What mainly interests me about French science fiction comics, beyond the fact that Moebius is very simply a master of his craft, is the fact that they managed to do work that looks to me very future-oriented. It's very technological, but at the same time very organic. And at the same time, it's cartoons, not illustration. Moebius' work is absolutely comics. It's cartoons. I believe that the only good comics are cartoons. Comics spring from an individual's mind. The strength they've got is that they're personal, and nothing's more personal to me than cartoons and storytelling. Frank Miller believes in cartooning, and that is not being used as a pejorative here. And his words of praise for Moebius are ones that should be heeded, because he's dead on right there. He continues on to Moebius over here in the next page. If Moebius were not a masterful draftsman and a masterful storyteller and a masterful comedian, just the fact that he came up with forms for technology that nobody else saw before makes his work important. I believe he is the most imitated artist in our culture. You go to the movies these days, and you see Moebius-influenced work if it's science fiction. Indeed, Moebius himself had worked on Alien and Tron, so that was pretty much all the science fiction at the time. And Star Wars, as we know, borrowed a little bit from Valerian, so it's all there. Frank Miller goes on, he's had an impact on his culture and his science fiction work particularly, and he's had an impact on me. He came up with a vision that seemed brand new. Specifically, what made me think of Moebius when I started working up the series is that his technology is organic. That's very true. You can see it in all his science fiction, futuristic work. There's a lot of rounded edges. It's not all harsh, sharp corners like you may have seen more of in science fiction of the day back then, before we got to the world of, like, you know, Star Trek The Next Generation, and a lot more rounded edges happened there at that point. It comes from people, he says. There's nothing cold about it. There's nothing metallic about it. In a strange way, I find that encouraging. The technology could be that plainly an extension of human life as it is in Ronin. The level of believability that Moebius brings to science fiction comics is just remarkable, and the fact that his technology is stuff you can touch. Until Moebius, most technology looks so damn cold and clean and sterile that I didn't believe people would walk into a room of that technology with a cup of coffee. That's what really makes a difference between a movie like 2001 and Alien, where you've got astronauts smoking cigarettes and the whole thing is very human. That's something I'm attracted to. I couldn't get comfortable with the old kind of science fiction because I'm not in love with polish and sheen. I'm not slick. I don't want to be slick. Moebius is not slick. Not unless he wants to be. He can be anything he wants to be. So that's Miller talking about Moebius. There's some more comments about Japanese and French influence on him there, but I'm not going to read this whole thing. It goes on along. I mean, look at this. That's like 10 pages later. We're still talking about things here. Miller is still talking about Ronin. And there's a reason why I bookmarked this page. It's probably this one, the copyright question over here. Because Frank Miller owned Ronin, or owns Ronin. He owns at least part, if not all, of the copyright. He explains. The negotiations between Frank Miller and DC over his contract to do Ronin for the company were quite long. Miller explains that this was because both parties involved were on brand new ground. Beyond that, I can only say that business got very involved. There are a lot of questions to be answered. The subject of copyright and trademark is much more complicated than anyone who didn't previously know about it could imagine, because nobody knows anything about it, essentially. The copyright law is a very confusing one that may be changed at any time. That is still the truth to this day, to be honest. I think we understand it better, but the big publishers have better and more weaselly lawyers, so they can find ways to get around things. Miller retains the copyright to Ronin, as well as certain other rights he prefers not to discuss his contract with DC in any more detail than that. So we don't know what those other rights were, probably republishing, anything to do with other media. You would think, or he was just talking about Moebius working in science fiction, influencing a lot of movies like Alien and the like, and Tron. Maybe he was thinking about multimedia stuff at that point with Ronin. It's never happened to date with that particular book, but you never know. He may still have the rights to that to this day. He also points out that his contract will not be the same as others that other parties may negotiate with DC, since there are some things that are important to me that aren't important to other people, and there are some things that are important to other people that don't mean a thing to me. It's not a holy war. As with anything, you negotiate, you give away some to get some. So here's the earlier days of creator ownership, especially in light of Marvel and DC. Working with Marvel and DC and still owning some level of the copyright was new back here in 1983. Ronin was all the talk. Here we can see Comics Interview magazine, which basically was a competitor that was advertising inside of Amazing Heroes, had a big Miller's Ronin cover story with an exclusive and very revealing interview with Frank Miller, in case the last 30 pages weren't enough for you. This part is interesting. I like this ad here. It's actually from it's a public service of the magazine. If anything is mailed to you without your permission, books, records, stockings, or something more unusual, you can keep it for free. If the company sends you a bill, you don't have to pay. The law's on your side. For more information, write the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. Mail ordering things was still relatively new at this point, and I'm not sure if that's still the law today or not. It probably is, to be fair, but if, they send you something you didn't order, you could just keep it. And here's a lovely cartoon by Gay and Wilson to go along with it. I hope I pronounced that right. Here's a look inside DC's new talent showcase, which, of course, this being 1983, had some interesting names that were considered new talents back then. I think Tom Mandrake was included in this, probably fresh out of the Kubert School at that point. Here's, I think it's Marv Wolfman, who was editing at the time, saying, "I'm trying to look for things that haven't been done to death. If no one sends me any more ninja stories, I'll only be too happy. We're looking for original concepts." Blame Frank Miller for that one as well. Jeff Isherwood, who would later go on to do, I think, mostly inking? Maybe? I want to say some Suicide Squad work? Something else you saw in the future? Gary, Quappish, who I think did some work with Chuck Dixon, did some other pages for other drawings for Amazing Heroes at the time. Was involved with it as well. Geppi Sabatini, who I don't know if we know who he is to this day. There's Tom Mandrake's name I see there. Mike Chen, who I think would go on to work at the Kubert School, if I'm not mistaken. Just some new talent that saw their way into comics there. Here's some more Starhawks comic strips. I think I mentioned those in a different, Amazing Heroes number 14 video. Take a look for it there. Here's a review of Ronin number 1. Frank Miller's Ronin is unusual, at least in some respects. This comic is a 6-issue MIDI series. I guess 4 issues is mini and 6 issues would be MIDI, which will be published every 6 weeks and bear a $2.50 cover price. It's a bit of a mixed review, but I think he liked it for the most part. And here is an ad for Geppi's subscription service, which might be the future of Diamond at this point. Moving on, Wonder Woman 300 gets a review. I also mentioned that was in the Coming Distractions, I believe, in Amazing Heroes number 14. Finally came out at this point. And a short review of Spider-Woman number 50. On page 39 of this final issue, a dead Spider-Woman is told, "All memory of you, every last trace, is wiped from all minds. It's as if you never existed. As one who disliked the character from beginning to end, I only wish that such a thing could truly be so." Ouch. And the letters column. What fun does the letters column bring us this month, besides why Wolverine shouldn't kill? Here's Mike Barr responding to a review of a preview, I guess, which he didn't like. And here is Kim Thompson at the end saying, the critic's anonymity, there was no name published with the review, was unintended, Mike. That was David Transu, and his name got left off the end of the review by accident, continues Kim Thompson. I take partial blame for the mistake involving Black Lightning. I should have edited David's review more carefully. Kevin McConnell is now once again the exclusive reviewer for AH, and I hope this will prevent such errors of fact from occurring again. Ouch. I mean, I don't know this David Transu fella, but Kim just threw him under a bus. Yikes. And one more bookmark here in the back from Jim Corcus and Don Rosa. Here's one of those things that would just not happen today. And if it happened, they would never admit to it. CBS TV announced it was going, this is 1965, by the way. CBS TV announced it was going to have a Tarzan series, but it's going to be set not in Africa, but on Venus. They said it was too much trouble to put it on in Africa and get all the things for it. So it's easier to set your TV series in Venus, another planet. This boggles the mind in several ways. But you can imagine the uproar that would happen today if you said we're going to do a Tarzan series and it's not going to be set in Africa. I don't think anyone's going near Tarzan these days for various reasons. Here's another interesting one from a comics journalism perspective. It's a letter from George Cashton to fanzine editors in early 1963. Get a load of this one. Because of the growing number of fan publications across the country in 1963, the editors at DC are instituting a newsletter which will keep you abreast of the latest doings at National. The information it contains may be used freely, as it is intended, only as a service to your subscribers. For publication in media that are not exclusively comics fan magazines, permission must be granted from National. Your comments are always welcome. Please address communications to me. In a way, it's a sort of a nice way for DC to recognize the fan magazines, the fanzines, and to work with them and to give them this little extra boost of information and this special look inside. But then they also make the next step saying, don't use this outside your fanzines. I don't know if any fanzine writers were writing for their local newspapers or anything like that, but if you're going to publish it beyond the fanzine, or if you're going to publish it, I guess, maybe in a for-profit major comics magazine, I don't know if any of those were around in 1963, then you had to get special permissions from DC. And it just reminds me of the early days of the online comics journalism world when Michael Doran for Newsarama would just email a bunch of creators. This is like the late 90s. Just email a bunch of creators and say, hey, what's new with you? What's going on? And they would email him back and tell him, and that would become his weekly newsletter. And that would be how news broke. A few years later, it would be clamped down and controlled completely by Marvel and DC, who would decide who would talk to who and when, and who would get the rights to the first bit of news over here, and then everyone else would copy it right away. That's why exclusives are kind of hilarious in the world of comics news these days, because everyone just cuts and pastes so fast. Many of which don't even add anything to it. They don't get quotes from anybody. They don't even add any opinion to it. Just copy and paste. But back in the day, things were a lot looser. or at least nobody knew what the internet was or what it was doing or how big it would become. But once it got bigger, they took control of things, and it became a whole lot less fun, to be honest. But that is it, finally, at last. So this did turn out to be a double-length review of Amazing Heroes for a at least double-length issue of 116 pages, mostly because I went on some tangents and quoted more of Frank Miller than I usually would. If you'd like to hear more about the individual interviews, let me know. Drop a line in the comments. Hit the like button if you like this video, if you want to see more. I've got a ton more magazines to go through here. Thank you all for watching, and we'll be back with more Amazing Heroes for real soon.